Hello and greetings. I'm Thomas Cox, and this is Restoring Trust, Reforms That Work. We're going to be talking about the ways in which institutions are failing us in the United States and what we can do to restore confidence in those institutions. Uh, of course, I'll be wanting to talk to people who might have something to say about that. Let's say political candidates, political office holders, folks with a background in that kind of reform. I'm very delighted that my first candidate this season is a candidate for House District 3 in Washington State, Antony Barran, who is, among other things, a very successful businessman and deeply involved in his community in Pacific County. He's engaged with any number of civic groups. He's given back in so many other ways, and he is going to take one for the team, I think, might be one way to put it, in putting himself up for the joys of running for political office in the United States in this day and age. Antony, welcome to the show.
Thomas, thank you. It's fabulous to be here. I'm thrilled and excited.
Yeah. Uh, and of course, I definitely want to hear a bit about your background, your campaign, your candidacy, but I want to open with a pretty standard question, and that is it a shared belief that you and I have that institutions are failing us? And what do you see as the role of a U.S. House representative in addressing that?
I'm not sure they're failing us completely. I think
Mhm.
that they have moved off track because they're focused on the wrong things.
Mm.
And so it's not necessarily failure. I mean, they're achieving the goals that they're trying to achieve. I just
Mm.
don't think those goals are in alignment with the average American, with what really drives us as individuals and enables us to achieve the success that we want. And I think that gap is creating an awful lot of challenges in our society today. And so is that it's a failure of delivery. And I think it's also a failure of recognition of what's really important to the average person.
Okay. And any sense from your side on what might be driving that or causing it?
Yeah, I think we have a tremendous problem in this country with the two parties that we have become taken over by the extremes at either end, and it's become extremely tribal. Purity tests seem to be so common at every level. Do you align and are you willing to support the agenda of the extremes in both parties? And those extremes really have very little to do with what middle class America wants, what Americans want for success. It's very small, very tight windows of you have to agree to believe in this, but forget about things like, can I find a job that pays a living wage? Can I afford to buy my first home? How much does gas cost today, and why does it cost that much?
Yes.
None of these issues are being addressed. What's going to happen with AI? That's not being addressed. We're dealing with either on the far right side, people saying, okay, now we've dealt with Roe v. Wade. Now we need to deal with gay marriage. And on the other side, it's, am I using the right pronouns? Um, are we respecting the rights of transgender people to a level that we deem appropriate? And these are kind of purity tests that, in my mind, I think are extremely damaging when they drive the agenda of the two parties.
So it sounds like you've got a different agenda, that neither of those two things that you've held out as being uh, the obsessions of the fringe on the two
Mhm.
sides. That's not what's got you focused. It sounds like you're talking intending to address uh, things like housing affordability
Mhm.
or the risks of AI and things of that
Mhm.
nature. So speak a little bit about what you're hoping to accomplish.
So it's been we got through the pandemic, right? And I think the pandemic had some really significant impacts on society. At least it brought them to the surface in a way that I think we hadn't really started looking at yet. For instance, in the third district, Southwest Washington, in the last 5 years, we've seen incomes increase by an average of 14%. Um, We've seen minimum wages skyrocket. They're now at 17.73 an hour. We've seen poverty, right, or households in the district that fall below the poverty line have only reduced by 1%. So
Wow.
while we've seen incomes increase, we haven't seen it translate in the way that you would expect it to, right? But the worst part is while we've seen a 14% increase in incomes, we've seen a 52% increase in the cost of housing in the area. So
Oh,
what was a, a growing disparity between the people that own a house and the people that want to buy a house but don't have one yet has gotten, that gap has got, or that chasm has gotten wider and wider and wider. And I think a lot of that is because we've seen small and medium-sized businesses really, if not disappear, get much less prevalent in our society. And as a result of the drop in employment in small and medium-sized businesses, we've seen a degradation in the middle class. And there is a direct correlation. If you talk to economists and look at our economy, there's a direct correlation between a robust middle class and a robust small and medium-sized businesses. And that as a business person, as somebody who owns small businesses, I can tell you that there are a couple of things driving that, right? One is we're very reliant on government. You know, in Pacific County, for instance, they're the largest employer. And so we deal with more regulation than I ever imagined. We own an oyster farm. We deal with 14 different regulatory agencies.
I'm
They
sorry, 14?
14.
14.
14.
I have a client who does biomedical research, and they have three. I thought that was a lot. And it
No,
probably is. 14.
we we
Okay.
we deal with multiple groups and agencies. We report to multiple groups and agencies. Um, at the federal level, it's the Army Corps of Engineers, it's NOAA. At the state level, it's Department of Health, it's WDFW, it's a number of people. At the local level, it's our local Department of Health, it's our local auditors, it's all of these things, right, that we have to deal with. And so that creates a tremendous amount of friction in our system. Small
Yeah.
businesses spend 38% more per employee on regulatory compliance than big businesses do.
Oh, because it's the same burden, but it's spread across less work, less business.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. And so what we need to do is really take a look at ways that we can get agencies, governments to do two things differently. I'd only like them to do two things differently, right? The first is I would like them to move faster. I'll give you a great example. We have a food truck that we bought a couple of years ago, and we've been trying to get it licensed in the state of Washington. And
Okay.
I sat down with an employee at LNI and went through the application. She said, okay, you've got everything, put it into the portal. It'll take 30 to 90 days, pay the check for $1,800 to get your truck licensed. Everything looks fine to me.
$1,800 to get it licensed.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's not including the licensing fees I have to pay in Pacific County to get a food license for it. This is
Oh, right.
only
Well,
to get a state medallion that it's legal to operate in the state of Washington.
okay. Got it. I clearly have no idea the depths
So,
of work involved.
yeah.
Do
So
continue. So, okay, you sat with L&I, you filled out your form, you paid your
I called her up
$1,800.
on the phone. I said, hey, I just want to make sure I get this right. And she said, great, here you go. We went through it. She said, put it in the portal. I put it in the portal. She said 30 to 90 days. 87 days later, I get a note from the reviewer, right, who is going to issue his opinion on whether or not we could get the medallion. And what I got back from him was, hey, I can't read the PDFs. Now I had downloaded the PDFs direct from people like Wolf, right, who's a common appliance manufacturer for kitchen equipment, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't read the PDF, so you're going to have to resubmit them, right? Which means you've got to start the process over. You've got to pay another $1,800, right? And it's not like I had custom equipment. He could have gone out to the Wolf site, taken 2 minutes, downloaded the same PDFs, right? But I now had to go back to square zero. I had to resubmit everything. I had to pay another $1,800. I emailed him back within 15 minutes of getting his note and said, hey, can I ask you some questions? And he already had his I'm on vacation, right?
Okay, so he was clearing you out of his inbox at the 89th
He was
day on the 90-day clock.
he was clearing out because the second thing that we need to do, in addition to having
Move
to move
faster,
faster,
yeah.
because government has no sense of urgency, and when you're dealing with businesses and people, time is money
Oh,
for
yeah.
everybody but government. But the second thing, right, that we really need to take a look at is, what are the KPIs, as we would say in business, what are the KPIs that we're really measuring government success against?
Yeah.
Right? Are we, government seems to be very focused on activity. And as John Wooden once said, you need to focus on results, not activity. And don't confuse the two, right? I think the direct quote is, don't confuse activity with results, right? And I think government has become very much activity based, because activity based is how they define how many people they need in their department. And the bigger your department, the bigger your budget, the more power you have and the more you're able to move up within state organizations. And that's the wrong KPI, right? That's not a value driven KPI.
Right. Kids, for the audience, if you're not a geek like the two of us, KPI is key performance indicator. It's a number that indicates what your performance is or ought to be. And in this case, activity as a KPI is just indicates that you're doing things, not that you're doing the right things or doing them well or doing them in a way that brings about an outcome that anybody wants. Like this guy who got your application, he reviewed the application. And so he did the activity of reviewing it. But why could he not have, the day he received it, looked to see if the PDFs were legible and gotten back to you with, hey, can't read them, send me fresh or something, you would
Mm-hmm.
think. And why should you pay twice because he can't read something? Bizarre to
Exactly.
me. But clearly they've never had to sign the front of a paycheck or deal or get a customer who had a choice on whether to work with them.
Exactly. But there are also a lot of things to me that don't make sense. So we have a huge issue right now with the DNR in the state of Washington with respect to timber harvesting.
Okay.
Right? Um, Revenues is supposed to be down 38%. They just came out with a whole new set of laws around the border area required around streams,
Sure.
right? And they just increased it significantly. And the numbers are that that's going to reduce timber harvest by $2 billion a year, right? What I find fascinating is why, when things like this are going on, our congressperson, who today lives in a timber-driven county, Skamania County, where it's interesting, in Pacific County, about 78% of our timberland is privately owned.
Yeah.
In Skamania County, it's less than 20%.
The rest being what? Federal and state.
Federal and state. And in the state of Washington, there is an awful lot of timberland that's federal, about 30% by my research, right? But it comprises less than 5% of timber revenue, right? And so if jobs and everything else and tax money and revenues are tied to timber harvesting, why doesn't our congressperson make that a priority? I get it, seals are doing bad things to the salmon population. There's a long run there. I get it, she just posted a video that she saved 3 jobs in Raymond or in South Bend in my county by taking a boat yard that was privately held and putting together the money to buy it so that the local county could own it and operate it. But we're talking hundreds of jobs, right? We're talking the main driver of Raymond, Washington, with a Weyerhaeuser mill. We're talking about one
Yeah.
of the main drivers of industry, but also one that impacts downstream so many others. It's what I would call an upstream industry, right? Because construction is reliant on timber. furniture is reliant. I mean, everything's reliant on timber, right? And so
Right.
why isn't she fighting to get more federal land open for harvesting? Right? We have very little old growth forests in this state anymore. They've all been harvested. They're all multi-generational growth being managed by timber companies and landowners and everything else. Why isn't she replacing the land that's being taken away by the state with federal land? I would think that's a
Right.
relatively easy thing to do, right? Is just have BLM open up more land, have the U.S. Department of Forestry open up more land that they have available for harvesting that they're not using. It's about priorities.
Right. Okay. So it sounds to me like you're very much focused on job opportunities, things that the federal government could be doing to open up um, uh, current constraints on job formation, value creation,
Mm-hmm.
upstream activities like timber harvesting that then feed other industries like housing, furniture, and so on.
Yep.
Okay. And that the pattern that you're seeing is too many of our agencies are run by attending to activity metrics rather than outcomes that matter to people. The creation of jobs, the creation of wealth.
I think it's more fundamental than that. I
Okay.
think I don't blame or lay the reason for why we're having these issues at the feet of the people running those departments,
No,
running,
clearly not.
right? I lay it squarely on at the feet of our US representatives, our senators, our congresspeople. I lay it squarely at the feet of our state senators and our state representatives because they're not setting the priorities. They're not leading
Mhm.
and saying this is what we really need to focus on, right? They're not giving a vision to those departments of this is what your priority is. I'm a big fan of the theory that you should operate within a 3-foot world,
Mm, a
right?
3-foot world.
3-foot world. So in special forces, they say operate in a 3-foot world because it allows you control the things you can control, and then it allows you to ignore everything else you can't control becomes noise, right? And so for me, I would think that our state senators and our US senators and state representatives and federal representatives should be really focused on setting the agenda for those departments, right?
Okay. Any thoughts on how you would do that? Because I'm aware of some other examples that I wouldn't mind bringing up if you wanted to hear my stuff, but you're the
Yeah, no,
guest, so I
go
want to make
ahead.
sure you hear you.
Yeah.
So one of the examples that I bring up when it comes to like how could the legislature get agencies to perform better, it's like, go get better people in there. Well, yeah, or set up better incentives. And so, for instance, the Labour government in New Zealand, when they were facing a terrible budget crisis, realized that they needed to stop paying for activities and they started purchasing results. And the deal they made with their agencies was, look, we want you to maintain pothole-free roads. And we're not going to pay you per pothole. We're going to pay you per mile of smooth road. And or whatever the equivalent was. So it's not like, oh, we can like, you know, patch a lot of like, I'll patch this pothole 5 times. Oh, well, look at me. It's like, nope, you get no extra money for that. You get paid for smooth roads. Uh, the They went so far as to turn every school in New Zealand into a private school and give the money to the parents to give to the schools, which led to almost no flight from the formerly public schools because people like their schools. But it took a big bite out of the bureaucracy because the money was going right into the schoolroom. And then some of it would go up to pay for the bureaucracy that the schools felt they needed, as opposed to the amount of bureaucracy that the bureaucracy thinks you need, which is an inversion of the power structure. And so this concept of paying for outcomes, and then you'd have to, of course, well, then you got to define your outcomes. And when things like that are done for, let's say, homeless services, instead of paying for activity on a safety net that's more hole than net, and people get partway through some recovery process, fall out, get back in, make partway through, fall out, get back in. There's kind of a revolving door or a conveyor belt that just recycles the same poor folks through partial recoveries. But all the service providers get paid, right? All the members of the what's now being called the homeless industrial complex, they're all cashing their paychecks every 2 weeks. When you switch that to we will pay you for everyone you successfully rehabilitate, suddenly people are much less interested in what is doctrinaire or what is approved, and very, very interested in what works with John over there, or Fred, or Chris, or Randy, or Janet. And they become deeply interested in finding out what this person actually needs right now and finding cost-effective ways to do it. One of the most cost-effective ways that I'm aware of is finding people they're partway through their recovery journey and paying them a small amount to help people who are not as far along, to help them forward. And that, in fact, is the model that is used in a private organization called the Delancey Street Project out of San Francisco, which is run entirely by ex-convicts. They take no taxpayer dollars whatsoever, and their recidivism rate is in the single digits. They have a tremendous track record of helping people successfully get out and stay out of prison and get off and stay off drugs. And they do it by helping each other in a very disciplined and structured way, where they care very much about results, and they take a lot of responsibility, and they don't have an infinite taxpayer spigot to draw from. And that I think is, if anything, is the overarching structure here. It's knowing what you're trying to accomplish, paying for the results you're trying to accomplish in ways that are, sensitive and attentive to things like regulation and human dignity and whatnot, and then providing the flexibility and accountability at the lowest level possible to achieve the result in cost-effective and inventive ways. And if all this sounds like, wow, that's a lot of work, it's like, yeah, but we could afford it, and it would actually give us the results we want.
Yeah.
And where these things have been tried, they've worked very well.
I work with a charity in Jamaica called PAVE, the Portland Arts and Vocation Education Institute, right? And every year we go down and we take, a couple thousand oysters and a couple 100 pounds of crab and other seafood from the area, and we donate all of the product to do their biggest fundraiser of the year in Jamaica. And we love working with PAVE. It was started by some good friends of mine out of Miami. His wife is Jamaican, and it's up in Port Antonio, which is in the northwest corner of the state, miles from everywhere. And one of the things that really impresses me about PAVE is that their metric that they measure success against is what percentage of the at-risk youth we bring in and teach vocational skills to, which is what they do, how to work in tourism, how to work in various industries. What percentage of our graduates that we placed with a company, right, they have 100% placement, what percentage of them is still employed by the same company 4 years later?
Oh, wow.
And it's 78%.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, right. And two things come out of that. One is you look at the ECSA program in the state of Washington. I sit on the board of Pack Mountain, which is a 5-county, Washington workforce focused NGO. And so I've had to learn about things like ECSA. And ECSA is really not just about getting people jobs, but about creating sustainability for them and getting them on a track to where they have living wages and they have stability in their lives, right? And one of the interesting things about PAVE is that critical to their success isn't just the vocational training is great and their employers like them and everything else, but they teach them all of the life skills you don't learn in school. They teach them how to balance checkbooks. They teach them about financial management. They teach them how to read a lease for an apartment, how to do all of these different things so that when they get their job, when they start working, they can also start building their life.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, getting a paycheck every 2 weeks gives a tremendous sense of stability in your life, right? There's a
Yes.
predictability. And one of the biggest challenges we have in this country today is how we've allowed the gig economy to really gut
Mm.
millennials and Gen Zers.
Mm.
I put up a blog on my website that talks about how damaging 1099 employees are for, or 1099 employment is for those workers. If you go to work for a company, right, and setting aside health insurance, everything else, you just work for them as an employee, right? Because you're not paying the 15.3% tax that 1099 employees have to pay in addition to everything else, it's
Right.
going to cost you $600,000 a year to be a 1099 employee over the length of your career, right? Assuming
Wow.
20 to 65,
Wow.
right? That's money that corporations have absorbed, right?
Sure.
And
They're
they've
no longer
shed all
footing
their
it.
risk.
Yeah.
And so
Pushing
we
out their risk, pushing out their costs, pushing out any number of things. Right.
And what's interesting is when you contract with another company as a vendor, right? All of those contracts say you're being treated as a company as an independent contractor,
Yep.
right? So what I would like to see is that unless you have a federal tax ID number, you're
Mm.
a business,
Mm.
that we eliminate 1099 employment in this country.
Wow. That'd be a bold change.
It would, but it would force companies to do a couple of things that they don't have to do today, right? We have tripled our staff at the oyster farm in the last 9 months because of our growth. But every time we hire an employee, we don't do any 1099 labor, right? We have all employees. Every time we go to hire someone, we're hiring them based on the fact that this is going to be 5 day a week, 40-hour a week employment, and that we're hiring them to work for us for 15, 20 years. And so we ask ourselves the question very clearly, are we trying to respond to some sort of surge in business demand that is temporary or cyclical or short-lived?
Yeah.
Or are we filling a position that is necessary for the long term of this company?
Right.
And if it's a short-term thing, then we sit down with our team and say, look, everybody, let's 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 slog through this for 2 3 months, and if we find that it isn't a short-term thing, then we promise you we'll hire people. I mean, we had one person earlier this year who's fabulous, who sent us a note in February, right, that said, hey, we need more people on the farm team, and if we don't get more people, I'm going to leave in October,
Okay.
because October is when our summer tourism season ends, and he knows that. And it was his way of saying, guys, this is a long-term challenge that we're facing. And so we have that communication with our employees, and I think most small business employers do, right? Hey, I'm stressed out, right? And I don't think we have enough people. And can you look at hiring more people? And I think we need to change the mindset in this country about what we're measuring against, right? And so I think ECA is great, but it's kind of, we'll do our best commercial efforts to find jobs for people that is sustainable. Instead, we should be measuring once someone gets placed through an ECSA program or WIOA, right? WIOA, which is a federal program. What do they look like in 24 months after placement or 36 months after placement? Right. Whereas right now they're looking at it saying it's on the job training. So how many people are we getting into the program? It's not how many people you're getting into the program. It's how many people are still gainfully employed with the same employer in 24 months.
Right.
Because if you're working for somebody for 24 months, if you're a 1099, especially in Southwest Washington, you're jumping from job to job. You don't have a consistent W-2. You don't have any way of getting loans because you don't have that consistent W-2. And so if we enable employers through a little bit of carrot, a little bit of stick, right? I think that there are a lot of things that we can do to help employers offer better benefits, and be able to take them on. And part of that is tax credits.
Okay.
Because small businesses in the United States, well, publicly traded companies pay an average of 6.2% federal income tax, right? Out of the 22% in theory that they're paying. Small businesses pay an average of 28.9. So again, small businesses are carrying the load. They pay 38% more per employee
Right.
for regulatory compliance. They pay 4 times as much in federal taxes. Right. I think there's a lot we can do to enable, and all that friction is why so many multi-generational families are selling to private equity today.
Yeah.
And I see it, right? And so we really need to rethink how we are approaching employment in this country, because I think the way we're doing it today with the gig economy is feeding this naive belief that socialism is a solution.
You will not find me agreeing with the idea that socialism is a solution to anything other than how do we impoverish ourselves as quickly as possible as a nation.
You know, my mother was born in Lithuania, and she fled Lithuania at the end of World War II. And in 1991, when the Iron Curtain fell, nobody ran to Russia. Everybody ran to the West. Lithuania couldn't get into the EC and NATO fast enough and align themselves with Western capitalist markets. You know, and I think there's a great misconception about socialism in this country from the perspective of Nordic or Scandinavian socialism.
Yes.
Everybody points to that as that's the model, right? And at the same time, they say you've got to tax the wealthy, you've got to tax corporations more, right? We're seeing
But
that.
when you actually look at Nordic tax rates, you'll find that they tax corporations quite lightly, less than we do in the US,
Yep,
and that the bulk of taxes are on the middle class,
exactly.
which is where most of the money is earned.
Yep, exactly right. And in fact, Norway brought in, what, about 5, 6 years ago, a billionaire tax. They lost half the billionaires in 12 months.
Yeah, France also tried a wealth tax in 2014, I think it was, and got rid of it within a few years because it cost more to administer than it raised.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a cash loser on the front of it. And people who are very wealthy tend to create jobs, tend to spend a lot of money, and tend to be very mobile.
I think that's the strip everything else away, right? And when you look at government and politicians today, and it's really what motivated me to get into the race, none of them have the first idea how to actually grow something, how to build it, how to be business development generators, right?
Right.
Because
They're happy to tax
Mhm.
this thing called business, but they don't seem to have any sense of like, how do you get more of this thing that you want to tax? It'd be like if I were milking cows, I'd want healthy cows and I'd want more of them.
Yep.
And there seems to be very little sense in Olympia or DC that that's even an interesting question of how do you make sure that the private economy is robust enough that you can tax it at a reasonable rate and get good money out of it.
Well,
Whereas the Nordic countries have done that very, very well. They have very, very robust capitalism in the Nordic countries, very high level of competition, relatively low level of taxation, an appropriate level, I would say, of regulation, and a very high level of taxation on the middle class, who are also the consumers of a lot of the social insurance.
yep,
That
exactly. But there are a lot of, when you run businesses, as you know, you're always looking for what are they call it low hanging fruit, which I always found is a bad analogy because the fruit at the top of the tree rises the fastest, but bygones, right? But low hanging fruit, easy to grab, easy to get. There are
yeah,
so many things that politicians could be doing to help create jobs in their district. I'll give you one really simple example. Nobody supports small business, no congressperson, no senator, no state representative or state senator supports businesses, small businesses, by saying, hey, there is $1.7 trillion a year, every year, of federal contracts that are set aside for small business, right? Earmarked for small business. Only 1% of those contracts actually go to small businesses. 99% get to a date on the calendar. And at that point in time, if nobody's applied, then the federal government opens it up for everybody and the big companies come in and swoop it up because they've got departments doing this. But why isn't our local congressperson setting up 2 or 3 people in their district office to build a database of all the businesses in the area, categorized by NAIC or SIC code, how the government categorizes their business type, and then emailing them all saying, hey, this week, these are the contracts in the state of Oregon or Washington that you could potentially bid on. Let us know if you'd like to. We'll help you write it. We know that, some businesses say they don't get paid fast enough by the government. So we'll sit on the GSA and make sure they pay you quickly, or whatever department it is, and we'll help you work through that. And just be able to start creating $100 million, $200 million, $300 million of additional contracts going to small businesses in the area. The small businesses don't have the time to fill it out. They don't have the understanding, the knowledge, or the education, right? So why not build resources focused on how do we help our small businesses in the area grow with really simple things that we already have, that doesn't require legislation, that doesn't require a lot of investment. It's just 2 people who are getting on the phone saying, hey, there's a flooring contract at the VA hospital in Vancouver, right? It's 18,000 square feet. You're a flooring company. Do you want to bid on it? And if so, we'll help you write the bid. Not complicated, right? And imagine what that would do to a small business person. I mean, probably $6 a square foot installed, right? Or $10 a square foot installed. That's a $180,000 contract for them. That makes a big difference for a 4-person shop.
Yes, it does.
And they're not thinking about this, right? They're not thinking about singles, nor are they thinking about how do I leverage my position outside of DC, because I've got gravitas. I can get any CEO in the country on the phone in 25 minutes. All I got to do is call up and say, hey, this is Congressperson such and such. I'm calling from this district. I'd like to talk to the CEO. Whoever answers the phone the first time is going to get you to the CEO. It's not difficult.
Seems extremely likely, yeah.
And
then
saying,
what do you say on the call, though?
Well, that's the thing. You say, look, I read in the paper you guys are looking to expand, right? Or things are going well and you're looking to build a new factory. I would love to sit you down with people from our state government. I want to facilitate it. I want to bring in people from local government, whether it's a port authority or whatever it is. We want to help you get the best view of Southwest Washington that you can, because we'd love those 1,000 jobs.
Right.
And we'll
and we know the locations, and we know the bureaucracy, and we know the paperwork, and we know everything else that you would need. And here we are showing up in a coordinated and organized fashion to be welcoming to you, as opposed to, the food truck experience, which is probably what they're having in most other states, is, the bureaucracy is indifferent and unresponsive and burdensome and a barrier.
Yep. And I think one of the things that I hear constantly in meetings in Southwest Washington, when we've got multiple governmental agencies getting together, whether it's through Pac Mountain, or I was just in a meeting this week with Grace Harbor Community College, has a satellite location in Ilwaco, which is in Pacific County. And you've got all of these different constituencies on the government level, whether it's county, whether it's state, whether it's education department, whether it's EDCs, and nobody's defining swim lanes. So they're all tripping over each other or saying that's not my responsibility necessarily. And nobody's organizing them and corralling them and saying, okay, if we're going to go after bringing employers in, if we're going to go after creating really good, high-paying jobs, we all need to be pulling in the same direction. We need to be pulling together, and we need to define what everybody's role is. And nobody's doing that either. And I think that's the other thing that would require a congressperson to say, hey, I'm the most senior government official in this specific area.
Right.
And let's make this happen. Right. Let's figure this out. Let's sit down at a table. Let's define the roles. Let's go back and let's do basic business stuff.
Mm-hmm.
right? Let's look at the flow chart and process and say who's responsible for what, and then let's hold them all accountable for being responsible for it. And
Right.
then let's measure the result, which is how many really good jobs are we creating that allow people to be able to afford housing, right? To be able to afford the life they want, to give them the opportunity. And I believe in theory Y management that says everybody wants to do a good job. You just have to give them an opportunity to do it.
I would tend to agree that the vast majority of people, they value, autonomy. They value the ability to get mastery and get good at something. They value connection to purpose. They value connection to other people. And if
Yep.
you can provide them with those things, they are happy to do really good work and be recognized for it.
Yep. I totally agree. Right. And yet our politicians are off pandering and forced to live up to the expectations of the extremes, which means we're not talking about that.
I want to pivot if it's okay.
Yeah.
Uh, so as a congressperson, if you were to take office, you would be, overseeing the policy arm of the government, meaning
Hmm.
that you could be in a position, one would hope, to start telling the executive how they should measure their own actions, how they should be accountable for results, and so forth. Is there a particular federal agency that you think is particularly ripe? Is there a particular approach that you would like to take? Anything along those lines that you'd like to comment on?
I think that there are, obviously the SBA is quite powerful.
Okay.
And the SBA has an opportunity to
SBA, Small
really
Business Administration.
small
Yeah.
business administration has an ability to really generate foundational change, right? And influencing policy across all of the other agencies within the US government that have a connection to commerce, right? Whether it's Department of Labor, Department of Transportation, right? All of those two are very critical, but I think the SBA has an opportunity to be a coalescing force for good.
Hmm.
And I think right now it's missing a bunch of things that it could be doing. And I'll give you an example. So one of our companies owns a building in downtown Ocean Park, right? Tiny little town. And we have an SBA loan that we use to pay for it.
Yeah.
We use it as office space and also have a yacht club there that we put in that's open to the public and does a lot of community stuff. But the SBA, if you look at their lending document for that, it basically reads like a residential mortgage. As long as you pay your taxes, as long as you have insurance, as long as you make the mortgage payments, we don't care.
Okay.
But because they're only guaranteeing 85% of the loan, because banks have a 15% liability in there, they lay on their own set of covenants or
Hmm.
rules onto the loan that says you
Right.
have to report this and you have to report this and you have to have meet this ratio and this ratio and this ratio.
Right. You've got this much cash. You got to have this level of
Exactly. You've got to have this
inventory
DCA,
value.
right?
Yeah.
DCSA, right? So, which basically says I have enough profit going through the company to be able to pay for the interest. And so that puts a huge burden on the small business to be able to have to report that regularly,
Hmm.
to then have to live up to it. And that's, why are we forcing banks to accept 15% liability? Why not just say we'll guarantee the whole thing? SBA loans have a very, very low failure rate,
Hmm.
right? And so there are things the SBA can do that just streamline for small business and take the stress away and the regulatory requirements, because small businesses rely on loans. They rely on cash flow, right? It's
Yes.
not like a big business, like Apple that has hundreds of billions of dollars in the bank and can do anything they want, right?
Right. Right.
Most small businesses are like most Americans. They may have 45 or 50 days of of expense cash flow in the bank, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, if you come in and you say, okay, we're going to work with the SBA and then we're going to work with Department of Transportation, right, to get federal highway funds. You've got this bridge that's trying to be built in Portland, right? That has become a consultant's dream. They've already made $300 million off of it as consultants, which means every time they do a report and charge more money, they have to make the project bigger, because then that makes their fee look relatively smaller as a percentage of the total project, right? Which, in my opinion, is why the whole thing has kind of gone sideways, right? You
Oh,
know,
I have all sorts of opinions about the interstate bridge replacement.
I'm sure we all do, right? Um, do we need light rail across the river, or could we build one bridge for 5 billion, build another one east of in Camas for another 3 or 4 billion, and then build another one over in Woodland,
There's a
right?
thought.
For the same amount of money. Or do we not build the one in Woodland, and do we build this high-speed train they want to build for $5 billion, right? To go from Portland to Seattle in 55 minutes. I mean, we're we get they get so myopic in their focus. So, working with Department of Transportation in our district where we live, we have no good east-west roads.
Yeah, I hear that. Actually, Hillsborough's got almost no good north-south roads,
Yeah,
Hillsborough, Oregon. In part because when Hillsborough was being laid out, it was a farm community and all the roads went into the market areas in the Beaverton area. So it's like lots of horizontal, no vertical. And they're largely restricted from adding in the vertical connections they need, the north-south connections, for reasons I won't get into,
yeah.
which hampers transportation, it hampers mobility, it hampers the economy.
But, we end up taking the two Oregon highways to get out to the west, right?
Okay.
26 or 30, right? We have four, which was the original road out before 30 was built, that went to Long Beach. But I've had civil engineers that specialize in highway building look at it, and they've said 4 and 6 and 8 have problems, and 12 have problems. And the problem is, in a great many areas, they're supposed to be 12-foot wide lanes with an 8-foot verge on either side,
Sure.
right? In many cases, they're 10 feet wide with a 2-foot verge. So when you take the case of Highway 6, which runs from Raymond to Chehalis and Tralia, right? There are some very sharp turns on it. It's a very narrow road. Weyerhaeuser is loath to use that road to move anything out of Raymond, and that's the one out of downtown Raymond, a half a mile from their mill to get east.
Right.
The bridges are starting to fail. Nobody's fixing the bridges. Weyerhaeuser said to me recently, "We think we're just going to have to rebuild the bridges with our own money because we can't use the road anymore." And so, you work with it, you figure out what small businesses need, and then you use the SBA as a lever point to get Department of Transportation to say, okay, this is critical because here's the commercial value of doing it, right? Here's what it means for jobs and livelihood and safety, right? And then you go to Department of Labor and say, look, we think that there is a path forward to create a lot more stable employment in this country, right? I don't think we use the SBA correctly. I think the SBA could be hugely powerful and a force for good in rebuilding and reigniting the middle class in this country.
Got it. Is there anything else? I feel like we should be wrapping up because we've covered a lot of ground, and I find that it's interesting, but I also want to try to be mindful of the listeners who
I
may.
wanted to, yeah, I wanted
Yeah,
to poke at something you said earlier, which is
sure.
the threat of AI.
And promise.
I vastly focus my belief on the promise.
Mm-hmm.
We take and again, it's something politicians aren't talking about, other than Bernie Sanders saying it's going to end the world and blah 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 blah. And Bernie Sanders is so old he probably actually can't spell AI, at least in a way that, or use it in a sentence other than bad. But I view AI from an employer perspective as it's not job replacement, it's task replacement.
Mm-hmm.
I personally think a lot of the jobs that we're seeing get blamed on AI replacement are really over hiring during COVID, right?
Right.
And after. And it's a convenient excuse that the market's much more willing to accept and reward. But we really need to take a look at how we're going to start transitioning workforces. and enable that transition and get ahead of it and put communities like Southwest Washington and Northwestern Oregon on the front of the wave of AI. And I think that's another thing that we really need to focus on. And the SBA, again, could really be helpful in creating, working with groups like Pac Mountain, right, and working with the state of Washington and departments of labor to say, okay, how are we going to work with small and medium-sized businesses to enable that transition so that they use it as an opportunity to grow, not a way to become more efficient.
Right. Because AI can be used to take existing work you're doing and do it faster, better, cheaper, whatever. But AI could also be used to enable new things you haven't done before, which is where growth comes from.
Yep, exactly.
Rather than just cost savings. I actually wrote a piece on the impossibility of AI creating a structural permanent reduction in employment. And I rested on three different papers. I think two of them won the Nobel Prize. And I'll just give you one of the arguments. And that is that for every task that you automate, and this has been true for every automation since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when you make a task automated, you make that has cheaper from a labor perspective, which makes that labor more productive.
Mm-hmm.
And that means either labor or capital is going to get more money for that task because less work went into it. And yet the economic output is identical because the output is identical.
Yep.
And so it used to be everyone had a pair of socks, maybe two, and you mended them and you washed them every day. And that's why you always had stockings hung by the chimney with care every day, because it was the pair you weren't wearing that you had just washed.
Yep.
And a complete suit of clothing that a middle class person might wear in 1800 or 1700 cost, in modern terms, in terms of the spinning, the dyeing, the weaving, which is all manual or on hand power tools, it was over $10,000 in modern funds. Not a $500 suit. Everyone's wearing $10,000 suits or more, and you had one because this is what you could afford. And then
Thomas.
in automation, dropped the cost of cloth so much, and people started like, I can have 10 pairs of socks. It's amazing. I can wear 3 different suits in my closet. It's shocking. Guess what? And now as a buyer, I didn't spend 10 grand. I spent 500, and I've got $9,500 to do something else with. And
Yep.
so while the needs may be, our wants can always increase, and there's always something to do if the market is allowed to respond to come up with the next thing that people might want.
I love your analogy and example, because in 1850, my great grandfather invented the process for the manufacture of ready-made clothes.
Oh, wow.
So what you just talked about, that was my family's invention during the Industrial Revolution, right?
Okay.
He was a tailor that figured out how to build a industrial process around the manufacture of clothes.
So that people could go and buy off the rack and it would fit.
Mm-hmm. He invented off-the-rack clothing.
Wow.
So I love that one. I think it's a great story, right? He also enabled the creation of labor unions in England because he felt that there was a balance that needed to be kept. He was the first one to do an employee break room, the first one to have not employed children, the first one to have reduced hours, the first one, right, for a 5-day work week, and the first one to welcome the idea of unions into his company.
Fascinating.
So there's a balance that has to happen between labor and corporations that isn't there today, and we need to fix that.
Yeah. Labor share of wealth has been dropping, and I personally blame financialization and game playing at the corporate level and frankly, at the federal regulatory level. But that
I blame publicly
episode.
traded companies, lobbyists.
I once asked one of my many chatbots to do a deep research dive and tell me, what is the return on investment for a corporation that invests in lobbying, as opposed to other things you could do with your money? And lobbying, even if it's only mildly successful, has a higher return on capital than literally anything else you can do, because you are going to the federal government and you are getting the government to tweak a rule to to move money into your pocket out of somebody else's,
Yep.
essentially.
It's regulatory arbitrage.
And it is a short path to corruption. And it is a beggar your neighbor strategy. And yet, for as long as those kinds of favors are available to be purchased, not only might you be an idiot for not doing it, but you might actually be failing to be a proper fiduciary for your shareholders if you
Yep.
decline to do something that everyone else is doing that you ought to do. And it might be a matter of self-defense to
Oh, very
engage in
much so.
at least appropriate lobbying, even if it isn't actual rent seeking.
Well, I can tell you that at the publicly traded corporation level, they don't hire lobbyists because they want to.
Hmm.
They hire lobbyists because they have to.
Right. Because otherwise, if you aren't at the table, you are on the table being served up to those at the table.
Correct. And if you don't do it, you'll be replaced by your board, and the next person will.
So it's not going to be we're not going to get rid of the demand side. We need to get after the supply side of government favors for sale.
Yep. We need politicians, and we're seeing it more and more every day, whether it's Minnesota and California and the wasted money. Government and politicians need to have a sense of fiduciary responsibility that we have in the commercial business world. It's just that simple. We're beaten up from a very young age, and I work for major publicly traded companies. You are beaten up at a very early age to recognize one simple fact. The money that you are doing, whether you're on a business trip, whether you're taking clients out, whether you're buying something, working with vendors, whatever it is, whether it's $1 or $1,000,000 or $100 million, it's not your money.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do with it as you please. You must do what is in the corporation's best interest. They're paying you a salary. That was the agreement. And politicians don't see it that way.
And it's up to us, I believe, to hold them accountable as voters.
100%.
On that note, Antony Barran has been my guest. You're a candidate with the Cascade Party.
Cascade Party, yeah.
Super. And your campaign website is?
Barranforcongress.com. Barran for Congress.
Outstanding. We'll have a link for that in the show notes.
Awesome.
And delighted to have you on. Hope to have you on again. And
Oh,
best of luck with your campaign.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure. I enjoyed it, and truly humbling to be in your presence.
You are the first person to say that, I think, ever. And I will treasure that. Thank you, sir. Take
Awesome.
care.
Thank you, Thomas. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.